be the final video for the Birka Hat tutorial. This is making of the chape. If you purchased a chape, just stick it on the tip and sew it on. If you haven't purchased a chape, then you're going to need to make one. So this requires some basic to intermediate metalworking techniques. It's not really that complicated. It's just a little hands-on with some of the tools and stuff. So I'll show you what tools you need, and let's get started. So the things you'll need for this this part of the project, you'll need some kind of metal to cut it out of, fairly thin, preferably annealed or at least somewhat soft, copper, silver, brass, bronze, something like that. Probably not brass. Bronze bends a little nicer. I have copper. This stuff is work hardened, so it's going to be kind of a pain to work with, but that's okay. You will need, for the pattern, you'll need some paper to draw on, a drawing implement, a ruler, and then scissors to cut the pattern out. To do the metal work, you'll need a pair of tin snips, a file, a hammer of some type, preferably either a ball peen or a cross peen. They tend to work a little more nice. And a anvil-shaped object. You can get them from Harbor Freight, Princess Auto, or Canadian Tire even sells them. Or some kind of just a metal block. You also might need a towel of some variety that you can fold up and put on the hammering surface. And I'll talk more about that later. You'll also need a file to file the all the edges, make them smooth, and you'll need some way of punching holes. Either one of these punches or a drill with a very small bit. You'll need a Sharpie to transfer the pattern to the piece of metal. And then the final thing you'll need is your basic sewing kit, some thread and a needle. This thread is silk. It's very strong, very abrasion resistant. But I would actually recommend using a thicker sort of waxed cotton or fake sinew type. It's just a little more strong. So, and that's that for the tools. So because this thing is going to be wrapping around the tip of the hat, what I like to do to make it really easy is fold the paper in half and then lay the edge of the hat on the fold, sort of in the middle of the paper so you have room on both sides. And then I go straight across here and then just trace the side of the hat. So you have sort of the basic profile of half of your piece. So then what you want to do is go a little bit, yeah, you want to go more or less straight. So you figure out how long you want the chape. And I like to go about 1/4 of an inch above this so that I can actually, or 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch above, so that I can actually make it come to mostly a point instead of having this flat that would create a tube at the end. So then I would probably go down so that it sits onto the hat about 2 inches at its lowest. And then I just sort of draw a line. Doesn't necessarily have to be straight because we're going to be drawing on the end of that. Now, I measure this. Comes out to about 2 inches, luckily. And then I'm basically just going to draw a little mark for the center of that line. Then I want this thing to have a bit of a dome piece at the bottom here. Or dome, just a circular piece at the bottom so that it drops down enough. And I'm going to go down about 1/2 inch, so let's draw a line. So you have this, it's traced. And then again, you probably also, thing I forgot to do is mark the top. So that's the actual mark. And I also want to go a little bit past this because it's making up for the edge here, the thickness of the pieces of metal, so, or pieces of fabric, sorry. So I want to go probably about to there. Now comes the difficult part for some, easy part for others. You want to, I freehand, you can come up with some way of dealing with it, another way with French curves or whatever. And I know measuring the center and then going here is going to affect the center of this piece, but that's not too big of a deal. It's about a 1/4 inch off. It's not huge, and you can always, when you're making the cone, you can always overlap that section a little bit if you're too worried, or you can measure different. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. So then you just kind of freehand that, and I'm just going to sort of freehand this piece and then just have it come kind of to a point. A little messy, but that's okay. So now you're going to want to cut this out. So scissors are important. So you cut this. So now you have the basic pattern for your chape. So when working with this stuff, it might be smart to wear gloves, because it can get very, very, very sharp, and you don't want to cut up your hands and everything. I am kind of stupid sometimes and don't, mostly because gloves make me lose too much dexterity for my liking. But I would recommend gloves unless you like the torture of 1,000 cuts. I would recommend, if you don't have much experience with sheet metal and everything, to buy something that's flat to cut the pieces out of. The gauge doesn't really matter unless it's really too thin or way too thick. Something in the middle works really well. You don't want it to be too flimsy that you can't, or that you can't. It doesn't hold its shape. But you also don't want it to be too thick that you can't bend it. Something that you can fairly easily bend by hand is a lot better. This is kind of work hardened, so it's not going to be as easy to work with as I would like. So now, once it's traced onto your piece, you cut it out. And one thing I've learned in all the time working with cutting out sheet metal is you end up with far less stuff to remove through filing if you don't let the snips fully close in when you're cutting. Because if they fully close while you're cutting, they can they create little sharp, almost needle-like pieces. And so sometimes it helps to do a long sort of relief cut away from the piece, especially in something that's shaped like this. If it was flat, it wouldn't be as hard. The ribbons would just sort of curl off. But and sometimes attacking it from the other side is a good idea as well, because these curve better in certain directions. And actually, as far as recycled copper goes, my favorite stuff to work with is actually copper pipe, because you can, usually it's not too work hardened like something that's formed into a tray kind of deal, and usually you can cut it down its side and then flatten it out into a sheet. So now that it's cut out, personally I'm going to flatten this first, and then we'll get on to filing. Okay, so that's flat enough for now. So what you want to do is remove all of the rough bits that were caused by cutting. And so hold the file sort of like this, and push it along, pushing in one direction only so you don't bend the teeth over. And it's basically just keep on filing along, flipping it around, filing the other side. Just to sort of break the edge and get rid of some of the rough garbage. When it comes to the corners, it might actually be easier just to take your snips and just nip that sharp little corner off. And that way, when you go to file it, you can sort of just take off those edges as well, and it makes it a lot easier and a lot safer. Especially something that's going to be flipping around next to somebody's head for a while. So I'm going to file the edges of this, and then we will get on to the next step. So once that's all filed, it's also a good idea if you're doing this in a place where you don't really want to get the dust and everything to put down some newspaper or something to catch the filings. So once that's all filed, you really want to make sure that you file these two portions very well so that the thread doesn't get cut by the edges. And so make sure that's nice and smooth, and all the edges are nice and smooth so that the person who wears it doesn't get cut, but also that those are very important. And so my powers of forgetfulness are just crazy today. I think it's probably because of the constant sound of jackhammering from the basement of the building. You need some way of punching or drilling a hole through this that's fairly small. And these are wonderful if you're doing lots of jewelry work and stuff. You can punch holes through fairly thick copper and other fairly soft metals, and even very thin steel. They just thread through, punches the hole. It's great. A drill will also work with a small bit. So you want to sort of find a spot on here that works really well. I think I'm going to use the bigger of the two sizes. I like to get it so that the piece of metal just barely fits between the punch and the die, and then get it pretty well centered, a fair distance from the edge of the copper, not too far, not too close. So I think that's pretty good there. And then you just thread it in until it pops through the copper. Thread it back out, and you have a hole. And so then we'll do that on the other side. Now, if your piece is softer than mine, this process is a lot easier. The forming process, where you can get a great deal of it done by hand without actually ever having to pick up the hammer. And you can get it rounding out fairly easily. So that's a pretty good start, I would say, to getting this rounded out. Parts of it will have to be moved around a bit to make them work better. So, many apologies for the dog hair and everything. Viking dog in the summertime sheds like crazy. So, once you have it sort of into this form, you kind of want to keep it rolling around. And one of the easiest things, if you have a little bit of a step on something and you kind of hammer it in, you can use the peen of the hammer or the back of the hammer to sort of get into the tight spots. A cross peen hammer might work even better than a ball peen if you can get in, like one of those little auto body ones. If you don't have a step, you can kind of do this a slightly different way, where you actually take something along the lines of like a face towel or something, a face cloth, or just a regular towel that you don't care about because it is going to get kind of smashed up and stuff, and you set it on top of here, fold it a few layers so it has a bit of give to it, so that it supports the back of the piece, and you hammer down onto it, and it takes the sort of shape of the hammer, and you can kind of form things that way. And the step just allows you to do it a little faster and maybe a little more controlled. And it's all about just getting that first little bit started, because then what I do next will sort of help even stuff out a little more. And you can also, if you've gone a little too far, you can hammer it on the flat surface, and it will help out that way. And so now what you want to do is angle it like that so you can hammer down on it. And you want to make sure that the piece doesn't slide and cut you. That's a pretty important thing. And you can always, if it hasn't been work hardened too much, you can always keep bending it by hand. And if you don't have strong enough hands to do it, you can always still continue to hammer. But it does sometimes pay to figure out ways to use the leverage of the human body to your advantage. So now it's all just a process of hammering and bending and making sure that you're never hammering in exactly the same place. You're sort of rotating it and doing sort of glancing hammer blows to kind of round it out a bit. And you can always use, if you have a round metal object that you're willing to use for that kind of thing, you can always use it. And it's just sort of doing everything you can to get it to round in. And it doesn't matter if these two ends kind of overlap at the moment. you're very much concerned about getting the top edge. Closed in. Because once you have that closed in, the rest of it comes pretty easily. And getting that shape comes pretty easily. So once you get it nice and tight on those edges, you can actually start to hammer down on the edge to start to push it out. And then it all just kind of comes into shape. So I'm going to go time lapse right now, just to save a bit of time in the video. And I will see you when this is fully hammered out. So this is about as good as I'm going to be able to get it with this. If the copper was annealed before I formed it, I would be able to get this fully closed and everything. And you can go one step farther than what I do, which would be to solder this joint and essentially make the piece one piece instead, or you know what I mean, one solid piece instead of one wrapped around piece that's overlapped. But the way that it gets sewn on, this will actually be at the back. So that you can also etch onto it, you can solder pieces onto it, like sort of granulation and stuff. And so I'm content with the way that this is at the moment. It's relatively symmetrical. There's a bit of a slight curve on that side, but it's okay. And also now is the point that if you wanted to clean this up and make it really super shiny, you can. I actually kind of like this sort of mottled color that sort of speaks of its previous life and stuff. It's got a couple dents in it, which I can't really get out right now because it doesn't. I don't have a horn at the moment that's narrow enough for this to be hammered out on. So it's going to be stuck the way that it is, but that's all right. I'm also considering punching 2 holes on the sides of these if my punch will fit, and that way I can sew it on a little more securely than just the 2 sides. So I'm using the most abrasion resistant thread that I have, which is silk. You can use pretty much anything. I think probably the best would be a brown fake sinew kind of thread. So to get this sort of on the hat properly, you want to sort of stick your finger inside. And you want to sort of pick which side you want it to flop to. The right or the left. I think probably the right looks nice. So what I'm going to do is thread up my needle and then stitch it on. So I punch the holes in the back too, just to make sure that it is on there highly securely. Just because you don't want it going missing at any point. And obviously this is not a hat you'd want to wear during any kind of combat exercise, because the chape can be quite dangerous. So you want to start by getting it seated in the position you want it, getting the end of it nice up in there, and then you go through the fabric, and then up through the hole. And you just do that a number of times until it gets sewn on as tight as you want it. I'd recommend going a number of times and also stitching from a couple of directions. I think it holds on a little nicer, a little more nicely than if you just sewed it on from one direction. It creates kind of a little V, and then you can stitch it. You know, maybe in this case, I'm probably going to go about 10 times each hole or each direction. You could probably get away with, 5 or so if you have a thicker thread. This stuff is quite thin, but it's very strong for its size. So I think that's a good last pass. Then you go sideways through the bottom here and do one stitch, and then you just tie it off the way that you normally do. I like to double knot. I don't know if it does anything extra, but it makes me feel better thinking that it's a little more secure. So then you stitch it on exactly the same way for the next holes until it's totally stitched on. So that's the hat. Like I said before, I don't know how authentic this design actually is. There's a lot of other possibilities for what the chape that was found by the guy's neck could actually have been from. Things in graves tend to migrate around a little bit, so I think that the hat design was a little bit different than this. But who knows? It's still popular in reenactment. This chape is actually, I think, a little large. I probably should have gone just a little bit smaller, but it is what it is. But some people put brooches on the side here to keep the hat from flopping around very much. With a design that's fairly dubious as to its origin or its actual look, I don't think that a brooch on the side of the head makes sense either. But hey, I guess to each their own, whatever they think is correct. But in my books, that's wrong. But this, I guess, is sort of plausible. I find the chape does weigh down the end sufficiently that it doesn't need the extra brooch there. So this hat certainly looks cool and everything. It's a nice thing. So I guess if you want to make one, they're very nice, and it kind of makes an interesting hat that you can wear during the winter time and stuff, even if you don't have it for reenactment. It's kind of just a crazy, weird design that is kind of fun. So I guess that's it. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the videos. I apologize for not getting on this one a little faster than I did. I'll try to, whenever I do multiple part tutorials, I'll either do it back to back, or I don't know whether you guys prefer it being in order. So so, the first video, then the second video without a break in between, or whether I should do what I did before, which was one day a week do one type of video, and then the other day a week do the tutorial with the parts going that way. So, let's say every Thursday you get a new part of the tutorial, or whether I should do it Tuesday, Thursday, until the tutorial's done. Alright, so again, thank you for watching. If you like what you see, don't hesitate to like and subscribe, and as always, comments below if you have any questions or comments or anything. And it's much appreciated. I do try to answer every single one, and I do like when people comment. It sort of lets me know what kind of stuff I should be talking about and things like that. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.